I'm Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald, and I am the chair of the foundation. And our other hosts are David Allman, hello, hello, and Bob Hatcher. And we are so glad you are here tonight. It's good when you have friends, and the thing that has been the nicest to me about being the chair of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation is the friends I've been able to meet. Because obviously all of you who support us are thinkers and doers and are interested in coming not only to a solution, but the correct solution. And you know when you get your Friday facts that there are people thinking, and you know when you get your Friday facts that there are ideas in the world, and tonight's celebration is to celebrate those ideas. We are so happy to have the guest we have here tonight. And to introduce him, though, I want to introduce somebody you probably know. And, you know, there are some people in the world that as soon as you meet them, you like them. And Johnny Isakson is one of those people. He's witty, he's charming, he's good-looking. Yeah, he's good-looking. And you think, that's a great guy. And then there are other people in the world that the more you know them and the more you're around them, the more you like them. For the depth of their understanding and the solid nature of their character and their ability to get in a complicated situation with complicated ideas and bring everyone into a consensus that's a working solution. And lucky for Georgia, Johnny Isakson is also one of those people. Those of you that have been around the foundation know that Johnny has been a friend of the foundation and a supporter of the foundation for years and years. And he has served Georgia, he served the people of this state, and I want to ask you to join me in welcoming our favorite son, Senator Johnny Isakson.
Witty, maybe. Charming, possibly. Good-looking, no way. I am pleased to be at the Public Policy Foundation. This is a great organization committed to bringing about good ideas and fostering those ideas in a nonpartisan manner, looking for the right direction, the right facts, and the right people to take our state to the right level. They do a great job. They are a great organization. They have a great leader in Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald. And they have a great full-time operator in Rogers Wade. And Holly Robinson and Kelly McCutcheon, who work tirelessly in that organization, do a fantastic job. I can tell you that when Brenda and I did a little extracurricular work in chairing the State Board of Education for a couple of years, it was ideas that came forth from the report card that the Public Policy Foundation puts out that really helped us steer the course of public education in Georgia in the right direction. So I commend them for that, and I commend them for a second thing. I first met our speaker tonight at a Georgia Public Policy Foundation event at this very hotel about 10 years ago. John McCain was here. He had flown in to do the speech. It was a room of one of the typical Georgia Public Policy Foundation meetings, a luncheon. I was asked to sit at the head table and sat next to him. It was the first time I'd had any exposure to him. I had no idea that a few years later I'd be elected to Congress where I could watch him from the other side of the Capitol, much less think I would ever have the opportunity to go to the United States Senate and be able to work side by side with him. You all know he's an American hero. You all know that he came from the state of Arizona and loves it and fights for it daily. You all know that he has strong beliefs, a strong will, and a strong commitment. But I want you to also know that every member of the United States Senate has a strong commitment, and every one of them sacrificed greatly for their country. But I know of no member of the United States Senate that works harder for his country, has paid more prices and sacrifices for his country, and fights every day for the right things and the right reasons and the right people and the right nation. It is a distinct honor and a distinct privilege for me to introduce an American hero, someone for whom I am proud to be a colleague, and a great American, Senator John McCain of Arizona.
I was over in California about a month ago doing a fundraiser for Governor Schwarzenegger. He and I have many similar attributes, as you can tell. There's a bunch of protesters, and I walked by and this guy, great big guy, looked down at me and said, "Hey, anybody ever tell you look a lot like Senator John McCain?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Doesn't it just make you mad as hell?" So thank you, Johnny, thank you for your comments about my service. I would remind you it doesn't take a lot of talent to get shot down. I was able to intercept a surface-to-air missile with my own airplane, which was McNamara's way of winning the war. I succeeded Barry Goldwater in the Senate, and Barry was a wonderful man. And the night of the election, when I was elected to succeed him, he got a little nostalgic, and he said, "You know, John," he said, "if I'd have been elected president in 1964 and beaten Lyndon Johnson, you'd have never spent all those years in a North Vietnamese prison camp." I said, "You're right, Barry, it would have been a Chinese prison camp." He was not amused. I work in the Russell Senate office building, which, as you know, was named after the great former chairman of the Armed Services Committee and truly great American leader, Richard Russell. And every day I walk by, if you've been in the Russell Senate's office building, you see a statue of Richard Russell there. He set a very high bar for service to country, for impact on history, for many things. To name one of our office buildings after him is quite a sign of the respect and admiration and affection that he inspired, not only in the state of Georgia, but around the nation. I want to assure you that I am keenly aware of the enormous contributions for a couple of hundred years that have been made to the United States Senate by citizens of the state of Georgia. And you know many of them names better than I. But I want to assure you that Johnny Isakson is more than qualified and has performed in an admirable fashion in the tradition of these great representatives from the state of Georgia. I am proud to work with him. I know of no one who worked harder to try to find, and he came very close to find a compromise on the immigration issue. I don't have to tell anybody in this room how strongly the emotions are of our Republican base on this issue. He came close. I believe that we will reach, and I'll be glad to talk about it some more later on, but I believe that we must reach a conclusion, and I think one of the key players in a result that we reach will be because of Johnny Isakson's knowledge of the issue, but also his ability to reach across the aisle when necessary to our Democrat colleagues. I want to thank Rogers Wade and Beth and all the people who were involved in this wonderful organization, and it's great to be back. And I'd like to make some comments, and then I'd like to respond to any questions or comments or insults that you might have. You all know that elections are approaching, and you know that the Republican Party, my party, has a tough fight on its hands. And part of the reasons are the difficulties of war and America's waning patience with it. Partly it's just a typical cyclical challenge for the party in power, the 6th year of a presidency. But part of it's our own fault. And we must not only remind the voters of what we have done to deserve their support, but acknowledge where we have let them down and convince them that we intend to return to the principles and policies that won us office in the first place. Many years ago, Ronald Reagan inspired me to change careers. His critics often derided him as nothing more than a talented showman. He had the gifts of a showman indeed, but he understood that the most effective public leadership is always that which is firmly rooted in authenticity. His was not a presidency that substituted slogans for principles, spin for truth, or window dressing for action. He was not content to leave well enough alone as long as well enough however unwell it really was, secured electoral majorities for them. And there is a lesson for us. Take on the big problems. Don't hide from hard challenges in the hope that exaggerating small advances or avoiding setbacks will trick the voters into crediting them as major achievements. Act on principle and trust free people who can, despite all the illusions and prevarications of modern political campaigns, still sniff out a phony. Show them that there are things that matter more to us than holding power, because when the people see us act on principle, sees us tackle the hardest, most consequential problems, and risk our personal ambitions in the process, they will draw the right conclusion that we are acting on their behalf, not just our own, and in defense of the interests and values that unite free people everywhere, whatever their political persuasion. Inspirational leadership challenges people. It doesn't seek to mislead them into a false sense of complacency or hide the realities, no matter how intimidating of a threat. No solution to any great problem can succeed if the full dimensions of the problem are obscured from public knowledge. Be honest and brave and determined to place the country's interests before anything else, even our personal interests, and the people will give us our chance. We face many serious challenges that threaten the quality of life we've managed over the years to achieve throughout our history. Through our industry, courage, and fidelity to our ideals, the world is changing. The immediacy of modern communications, globalization, the ever-expanding flow of international commerce in goods and ideas and capital all cause dislocations in the short term, even as they promise levels of prosperity for the entire world undreamed of a generation ago. We must make improvements in our industries, educational system, diplomacy, and other institutions that address those dislocations. But it must not be our task to devise policies to arrest the progress of commerce. We must expand its progress and ensure that ever greater numbers of people reap the benefits. These changes are driven by competition engendered by free markets that we have, to our enormous credit and benefit, long trusted as the engine of our prosperity. Indeed, the remedy to short-term dislocation is a greater application of free market principles to public endeavors. In American public education, for instance, the best impetus to prod it into making the changes necessary to prepare children to succeed in the modern world is to provide it a little competition, which at present only exists for those wealthy enough to afford private schools. The United States does not have an education system that befits the most prosperous society on earth, and it is not because we haven't spent enough money on it. It's because we have allowed it to develop so that it has no impetus to change, but only to guard zealously its own prerogatives. Those who reject this notion must sacrifice in their defense of the status quo the very people they intend to protect, the underprivileged, who won't have the opportunity to escape a change-resistant institution and force public education to reform itself. Another great challenge is our aging population and the challenge that poses for both public and private pensions and medical entitlements. We must inform the American people with unadorned candor that for many of them, the entitlements they were promised in old age simply won't exist in present form when they retire. We can either do something about that now, or let the problem grow far worse and leave it for our unlucky successors to confront. The best argument for our continued majority is that progress we have made in placing on the federal bench judges whose first priority is to interpret our Constitution fairly and conservatively and not substitute their ideas and wishes for our framers and the people we and they serve. The Fifth Amendment states in part, and I quote, No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This great country is different from others in many respects, not the least of which is our strong system of property rights. Your property could not be taken from you except for public use and then only with just compensation. In Kelo versus the City of New London, the Supreme Court undermined that principle by approving New London's use of eminent domain to seize the property of one private owner and transfer it to a commercial developer, claiming it was in the public interest. Well, it may or may not be in the public interest, but it's impossible to see how, as the court claimed, this involuntary transfer of property from one private owner to another was for public use, as the Fifth Amendment requires. The decision was widely and justly criticized by Americans, correctly seeing in it the destruction of the age-old tradition of using eminent domain only sparingly for purposes such as road building and other necessary public works. If government now has the power to expropriate your property for an economic benefit, none of us is secure. Who gets to define economic benefit? The courts? I don't know they were qualified for such work. We Republicans need to remind the public that we have long been the most consistent supporters of property rights, and that the appointments made by Republican presidents and confirmed by a Republican Senate will redress this wrong. Republicans, my friends, have held congressional majorities for 12 years and the presidency for 6. A danger to all majority parties, but particularly to conservatives, since it is so antithetical to our core philosophy, is the insidious, creeping conceit that to be the governing party, we must be the party of government. That's what happens when you come to value your incumbency more than your principles. Republicans should believe in a short list of self-evident truths: love of country, the importance of a strong national defense, steadfast opposition to threats against our security and values that matches resources to ends wisely, the integrity of the rights of individuals and the values of families and local communities, the wonders of free markets, encouraging entrepreneurship and small business, low taxes, fiscal discipline, and generally the government that governs best governs least. As a governing party, we should emphasize that government should only do those things necessary for the well-being of the nation and do them efficiently that individuals can't do for themselves. Much rides on that principle: the integrity of the government, our solvency, and every citizen's self-respect, which depends, as it always has, on one's own decisions and actions, and cannot be provided as just another government benefit. We came to office to reduce the size of government and enlarge the sphere of free and private initiative. But lately, we have increased government in order to stay in office. And soon, if we don't remember why we were elected, we will have lost our office along with our principles and leave a mountain of debt that our children's grandchildren will suffer from long after we have departed this earth. Because, my friends, hypocrisy is the most obvious of sins, and the people will punish it. Free people, even if they are not entirely convinced by your policy arguments, will appreciate that when politicians risk their office for the sake of their convictions, when they seek office to do something rather than to be somebody, that we've put the country's interests before our own and thus are worthy objects of their respect and for at least a time their support. We have to prove the efficacy of our policies over time, but we will have our chance. And we must seize it boldly to make progress in the tough challenges and to reaffirm to the public that we are about great things, hard things, that will take time and that can't be solved without the honesty, courage, and resolve we share with them. All problems, foreign and domestic, are best addressed with the honesty and courage and faith in our principles that remain, I hope, the distinguishing features of conservatives' approach to problem solving. Ronald Reagan knew that our security was best protected by advancing our values. We now face challenges that are different and more diffuse than those we faced in the Cold War. Some on both the left and the right argue that our advocacy of democratic values in Iraq and elsewhere is reckless and vain, that freedom only works for wealthy nations and Western cultures. Others argue that we're partially responsible for the jihadists, if not the tactics they use, by meddling in the world when we should stay within our own borders, protect our industries from foreign competition, and our culture from new immigrants. Some of these critics are of the garden variety, left as mystified by history's repeated lessons as they always were. But some were once determined cold warriors who believe that it was enough to have opposed communism and that once we had defeated the Soviets, our world leadership became an expensive vanity. But such a cramped view of our purpose is blind to the futility of building walls in a world made remarkably smaller because of the success of our values. A world where our political and economic values had a realistic chance at becoming a global creed was the principal object of our foreign policy for much of the last century. We conservatives were its most effective and ardent advocates, and it must remain our principal object today. We understood better than others that our security interests and the global advance of our ideals are inextricably linked. And we surely didn't accept the notion that freedom was the product of our wealth and culture. Our wealth and culture are the product of our freedom. We once thought we could leave Afghanistan to its endless misery once it was no longer a theater of Cold War competition. What interests of ours were affected by the oppression inflicted on an exotic and remote people? We learned the answer to that question on September 11, 2001. We once relied on our friends the Saudis, a reliable supplier of oil and purported force for moderation in the tumultuous politics of the Middle East. As long as the regime was stable, what difference did it make if it paid a little lip service and bribed money to extremist clerics who preached in their madrasas a toxic brand of anti-West hatred to men who had no other cause to live for? We learned the answer on September 11, 2001. There is no distinction between our interests and our values. They are the same. We must marshal our ideals into battle, and we must organize our diplomacy, our commerce, our intelligence, and our armies behind them. That doesn't mean that we have to risk lives and resources needlessly, lurching ineffectually from one crisis to another. But it does mean that we should defend our interests and values when they are threatened, using all means short of violence when effective, and military power when necessary. Strength and courage should be the qualities of our statecraft. We should make our way in this complex and dangerous world as we did in the great challenges of the last century, sure of ourselves, firm in our purpose, and proud of our heritage. We must show Americans we are intent on protecting them with the might of our armed forces, with improvements to our intelligence capabilities and law enforcement, with adept and wise diplomacy, with the hand of friendship to those who wish to help, and the hammer of justice to those who oppose us, and with the power of our ideals, the world-transforming power of the notion that self-government, life, and liberty are intended for all societies, all cultures, all people. Let us be clear in our appeals for support in this struggle, not to attempt to placate public apprehension with false promises of swift victory and passing dangers. They've seen enough of this war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and on our own streets to know better. We have an advantage over some countries. We are a practical and stout-hearted people. We can take the truth better than we can stand deceit and hypocrisy. Show Americans respect by being honest about the problem and its remedies, and they, in turn, will give us their respect. But assure them that we will prevail in this struggle. We will not be vanquished by forces that despise the laws and ideals that protect us. We will never surrender. They will. I thank you for inviting me tonight here. We live in very interesting times, and I look forward to responding to your questions or comments. Thank you for inviting me back to this wonderful institution. I've always believed that the issue of talks is a bit of a straw man. For example, many of you might remember that the Paris peace talks bogged down for nearly 2 years over the shape of the table. It had nothing to do with the shape of the table. It had to do with events on the ground and the situation in the battlefield. And the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese felt that they were prevailing. So there was no point in them talking. This business of 6-party talks, 2-party talks, 4-party talks, there's plenty of ways to communicate with North Korea. But the reason why the North Koreans want 2-party talks is to diminish the status of South Korea. In other words, we have North Korea talking to the United States, leaving South Korea, who clearly has more than a passing interest in what happens in North Korea. So I'm for talks, and yet there are times when our adversaries use talks to try to diminish the United States of America. Best example recently was the president of Iran coming to the United Nations and saying that he wanted to have talks with the President of the United States. That obviously would have just increased his stature and legitimized him to a significant degree, and not, as far as I can see, not achieve any useful goal. And by the way, there's lots of ways to communicate with Iran. There's lots of ways that we can have these communications. And one of the cardinal rules of diplomacy, and I'll stop with this, is usually when the highest level meetings takes place is when the outcome has already been determined. All the groundwork is done at the lower level, to wit, Kissinger to China, etc. So this rap that somehow the United States won't talk, will talk, but there are many other ways of doing that, carrying out those talks without it being something that could raise the prestige. Why do you think these 2-bit guys that can afford airfare to New York say the things they do? Because it gets them the attention that they seek. This guy Chavez comes to the United Nations and insults the President of the United States. I'm offended. I'm offended by it. Now, does that mean that I'm going to do anything about it? No. But I sure as heck am not going to give the guy any legitimacy when he does and says things like that. So, on the Korean issue, very quickly, because it is clearly the pressing issue and has been for a long time, I would remind you that for years we gave the North Koreans literally hundreds of millions of dollars in food aid, other assistance. We were building them light reactors, all in return for them not continuing their efforts to enrich uranium. And they blatantly violated that. And now they are seeking more and more pledges of support and help and aid in return for unenforceable agreements. Well, you know, fool me once, fool me twice, etc. The South Koreans have, in my view, been overly generous to North Korea, particularly since their own countrymen are languishing under the most Stalinist regime on earth, with the largest gulag now on earth. So in response to the nuclear test, I think that the President is exactly right. We've got to get sanctions from the UN, but we have to do one other thing in my view. We have to call up the Chinese. This is one case where negotiations or conversations have to take place. And we say to the Chinese, it's not in your interest to see a confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. It's not in your interest to see Japan become a nuclear power. It's not in your interest to see increased tensions in the region. You're doing just fine, China. Your GDP is in double digits. And all of this you're placing at risk because you refuse to play the role of a mature superpower. Start acting like it. And if you don't, because we all know that the Chinese are the only country that has any significant leverage over North Korea, and if they don't, then there are certain actions that we would take, which would make things more difficult for the Chinese. The Taiwanese have asked for significant weapons purposes. Maybe that would be back on the table again. The Japanese clearly are going to develop anti-missile defenses. They'd have to. Put yourself in the place of the government of Japan. And here's certainly not a rationally behaving nation with nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. So there's a number of steps that we can take to urge the Chinese to act in their own interest. In their own interest. I'm not asking them for some kind of charity. I'm asking them to act in a mature fashion which is in their own interest. And I would remind you, it is still a very undemocratic country, and we've sort of turned a blind eye in many ways to a lot of the human rights violations and other things that we have done in hopes that with economic development there would be a parallel maturation process go on. So far, I don't think I think we'd certainly give them mixed grades. And I'm sorry for the long answer, but this is obviously an issue and a challenge that we will be facing very, very seriously. I think one of the reasons why we have as much difficulty in Iraq is because we do not have enough NATO involvement. I would have loved to have seen more of that in Iraq. The commander, by the way, will be a British today. He's a British general, and it would rotate between British and German and American. I think that it's vitally important that every NATO nation have a stake in this conflict. I don't have to tell anybody here that we've seen the rise of the Taliban. We've seen dramatic increase in poppy growth and opium production, and it's a very serious situation there. We also know that apparently Musharraf has made a deal with some of the people that reside on the Pakistani side of the Afghan border. I cannot see how that would have a good outcome. So we are in very difficult times in Afghanistan, but I believe that a NATO commitment, which we are seeing, and I think they'll stay with, is beneficial to have an alliance effort there rather than what is perceived as another American go-it-alone action there. And I have great confidence in the British and German leadership. We've met some of them, and they're pretty impressive people. Yes, sir. Comment on when we might alter our support of the UN. First of all, and I don't like to be partisan, particularly at a gathering like this, but I think it would be very helpful if we would confirm John Bolton, who is the President's choice to be the ambassador to the United Nations. Elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. I'm not particularly embarrassed to tell you that I voted for Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer because elections had consequences. President Clinton was elected. He nominated these people. There was not a reason just because I don't share their philosophy that I should vote against them. But now we seem to have entered in a new era in the United States Senate, Johnny will tell you about it, where they just block people because they don't like them. I don't know anything that John Bolton has done wrong, except be a pretty tough guy and demand reform in the United Nations. I'm not so sure that danger would be of our government losing confidence in the United Nations. I do worry if the American people lose enough confidence that they're going to say, hey, we're going to stop paying 25 or 30% of their budget. And maybe they ought to find another place to reside. You know, they don't get any parking tickets. I know how nice it must be in New York to be able to do that. But and it offends us. It offends our values and our ideals when their Human Rights Commission has Liberia, Cuba, and Zimbabwe. Now, I mean, isn't that a joke? So, but finally, in summary on the UN, I feel a little bit like the old story of the guy in a small town. He said to his buddy, Saturday night, he said, what are you doing? He says, I'm going to the poker game. And he said, why are you doing that? You know the game is crooked. And he says, well, it's the only game in town. And the UN is really the only game in town. And so I hope that it can be reformed. By the way, small little insult, I don't know if you saw it or not. We finally convinced the United Nations higher-ups that they should, guess what, revolutionary, file a financial disclosure statement once a year, just like Johnny and I do, like all elected officials just about. I'm sure here in Georgia do the same thing. Guess what Kofi Annan decided? He would not disclose his financial statement. He filled it out, but I guess it's only known to him and his accountant. Now, what's that all about? The President of the United States needs the tools necessary to fight this unique kind of conflict that we're in. He has to have surveillance capability. He has to make use of every bit of technology that we have to track these people down, intercept their phone conversations, and do all the things that are necessary to prevent another attack on the United States of America. That includes, by the way, a program that the CIA may need for our most hard cases, our most difficult people. What the administration's first proposal was that they would modify the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions have been in effect for 57 years, signed by 155 countries, that sets out procedures and things that are guaranteed people, not just prisoners of war, but also prisoners. I won't go through the whole details of it. My concern, and Colin Powell's concern, and 5 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Jack Vesey, and 55 former 3- and 4-star admirals and generals, was all the same. Was all the same. If we interpret the Geneva Conventions for our convenience, the next time an American is captured by someone, say a CIA agent by the Iranians, then they would interpret the Geneva Conventions to their liking. And it was interesting, and it's a little bit brutal, but everybody I talked to had served in uniform agreed with me. The people that hadn't didn't agree. And I'll rely on Colin Powell, General Jack Vesey, 5 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm sorry it was muddled. I'm sorry it was muddled. But my obligation is to future generations of Americans who serve in the military, and that's really what this was all about. Now, we reached an agreement where the President can still carry out these special treatment for, and by the way, waterboarding is not one of them, nor is some other extreme practices, is not allowed. And he can interpret treaties still, which is his right under the Constitution, but we are not touching the Geneva Conventions. I'd also like to point out that Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, have hurt our image in the world more than I can ever describe to you. And as my friend General Jack Vesey, who received a battlefield commission at Anzio after everyone in his platoon was killed or wounded and later became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, any value of any information that you can obtain by torture can never counterbalance the damage it does to the United States of America's image in the world. His word is good enough for me. I'm glad we sat down and had serious negotiations with the administration. We came to an agreement that the President said was a good result. Most others didn't. Now, the New York Times, the ACLU, and other liberal media didn't like our resolution at all. They condemned it roundly. We were subject to 5 or 6 editorials in the New York Times that we didn't ban these special programs that we have done other things. But we were content with the result that we got. And finally, one of the things that you're probably thinking, well, these people would never observe the Geneva Conventions anyway. Well, you know what? They do. And the reason why they do, because they're afraid that we might retaliate if they don't. A couple of years ago, a CIA guy was captured in Somalia. They were mistreating him. We got the word to him. If you don't treat him according to the Geneva Conventions, you're going to pay a heavy price for it. Guess what? He was visited by the Red Cross, and he was later released. The Vietnamese, for reasons that are still not clear to me, changed our treatment the last year or so that we were in prison camps in North Vietnam. I don't know if it was our insistence on observance to the Geneva Conventions, but I'll tell you, at every turn our government said the POWs have to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, and they insisted on it. I don't think they could have insisted on it so much if we were making liberal interpretations of the Geneva Conventions for people who were captives of ours. So, and maybe it's a harsh statement, but General Powell, who I think is one of the finest Americans that ever lived, in his statement of support for our position said, the moral superiority of the United States is losing its moral superiority in the world. A statement like that from a former Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, should concern all of us. We had our distinguished head of the Department of Education. There she is right there, great American. She believes in No Child Left Behind. She's a strong conservative. She believes in charter schools. She believes in vouchers. She believes in many strong positions that maybe there are some unions that may not agree with. So you can be very proud of her. Let me just mention two things. It's always good to mention examples. There are 535 members of Congress, 435 congressmen, 100 senators. Not a single one sends their child to a public school in Washington, D.C. Now here's the quiz. What public school system in America do you think is the most heavily funded? Washington, D.C. So it's not the money. I'm proud that in Arizona we have many, many charter schools. Some of them have failed. They should fail. That's what it's all about. But charter schools are beginning to present competition. The mayor of the District of Columbia was so frustrated that recently he came out in favor of vouchers. Now it enraged, you can imagine what it did to the establishment. Why don't we try vouchers? What do we have to lose? What do we have to lose? And ask any higher educator about the numbers of people that are coming into the critical specialties in our colleges and universities in America, and they're very disturbed about it. Plus, because of 9/11, we don't have as many foreign students coming in to fill some of that gap, and it's a very serious problem. I would argue that what we need to do is enforce No Child Left Behind. Of course, as you probably know, it's up for reauthorization. If it needs to be fine-tuned, fine. But in all due respect, the establishment in America wants to weaken all these requirements. They want to say, well, you know, if you've got this many Hispanic students, you shouldn't have to meet this criteria. Well, she can tell you all of the arguments that are being used today. I don't think we should weaken it. I think we should strengthen it. I think there was one more, if that's all right, Becky. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Sorry.
What will be the first three pieces of legislation that President McCain will submit?
Stop pork barrel spending. Our base is angry because of the excessive spending, as I mentioned earlier. Eliminate it. Give the president a line item veto. Stop the earmarking, and just say no more. Could I just remind you, in 1984, Ronald Reagan vetoed the highway bill that had 152 earmarked projects on it. In his own inimitable style, he said, I haven't seen this much pork since I gave out blue ribbons at the Iowa State Fair. You know, that was not fun. You know? 2 years ago, the President of the United States signed into law a highway bill with 6,140 earmarked projects in it, including the now famous Bridge to Nowhere, which we're all familiar with. It's got to stop. It's like any other evil. It gets worse unless you eliminate it. And believe me, I love these people. They're honorable men and women. But they really believe it's their money now. They believe the money is theirs. It's not theirs, it's yours. So the first is to eliminate wasteful spending. The second is to fix Social Security. And the third is to fix Medicare. Those are the three priorities. Could I mention something about Social Security real quick? The partisan environment in Washington makes me so unhappy. You may have noticed at the President's State of the Union message, he said, "I regret we were unable to reform Social Security." The Democrats stood up and cheered that we can't fix a system that is broken, and we all know our children and grandchildren are not going to be able to receive the benefits. Contrast that with 1984 when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill stood in the Rose Garden after Greenspan had done a study as to how you can fix Social Security, and they said, we're going to fix Social Security. And it was tough medicine, by the way. I mean, we raised the retirement age, we raised taxes, we did, whether it was right or not, but it did fix Social Security. We've got to go back to that. We really do. And the longer we wait, as you know, the harder it's going to be because more difficult the financial crisis is going to become. And then I say Medicare last because that is by far the most complex of all of these, but at the same time, according to the Government Accountability Office, it's over $40 trillion unfunded liability. $40 trillion unfunded liability. Social Security is about 6, by the way, according to David Walker. But if we can have success, then success breeds success, as we all know in life and in football and in politics. But we have to go to the American people with clean hands, and that means we will no longer waste their tax dollars on, well, it was 2 years ago, I think, we appropriated $3 million to study the DNA of bears in Montana. Now, I don't know if that was a paternity issue or a criminal issue, but, so I think we can. Yes, sir, real quick.
One more real quick, sir. Please talk to us about Medicaid.
Well, the real root cause of all this problem, and I can't give you good answers, but I can say the root cause of the problem, obviously, is the inflation associated with health care. It's at double digits or close to double-digit inflation. National inflation in the last few years has been 1.5% to 2.5%. No system is affordable that has double-digit inflation associated with it. The costs just escalate too quickly. So it seems to me, and this institution has thought about this long and hard, and so have I, but I believe that there have to be incentives in the system so that we don't needlessly spend money. Now that's easy to say, but what about the last 60 days of life? We all want to save money until we get sick, right? But on the other hand, Ronald Reagan said nobody ever washed a rental car, and if it's not your money, then what the heck, I have a dear friend who has a big practice in Sun City, Arizona. Many, particularly elderly women who've lost their spouse, come in and see Dr. Harper because they're lonely. Come in and have a nice chat with Dr. Harper and, and leave. Well, we're paying for that. But there's no incentive for those dear, sweet people, and they are dear, sweet people, to not do that. You see what I mean? So let me just give you an example that I don't know if it works or not. Steve Forbes, one of the brightest guys on fiscal issues, I think, in America. His company, they give people $2,500 in cash. Every one of his employees, they get $2,500 in cash. Buy whatever health care policy that you want. If they get sick and they go through that policy and they get ill, then they will offer them another policy with an extremely high copay. Now, if that illness becomes catastrophic, then they provide catastrophic insurance. Steve Forbes says they've saved millions and millions of dollars in his corporation with that kind of incentive to not waste money unnecessarily. So I think that has to be a big part of the answer. And the other thing we got to figure out finally, in every part of America's free enterprise system, when you make a technological advance, computerize your accounting system, go online with your sales, all this, it saves money. That's why we do it. It saves us money. But somehow, in the practice of medicine, every time we have a technological advance, it costs us more money. Somebody's going to have to explain that to me. It's more expensive now that we have MRIs than it used to be when we had X-rays. So we're going to have to also figure that part of it out. Our former Air Force person is now getting the hook. They don't like Navy guys much anyway. So I would like to say we look forward to seeing you when you come to Washington, when you visit your money. Rogers, thank you for the great job you do. And remember, in 29 days, try not to forget the words of the late, great mayor of Chicago, who said, vote early and vote often.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your intelligence and your bravery in expressing your views and for being always thought-provoking.